Is there a problem, officer?
You're a long way from home, aren't you?
I live right there. I'm heading inside.
Doesn't look right. What are you doing in this neighborhood?
Coming from work. I'm almost home.
License and registration, now, and keep your hands where I can see them.
My hands are here. I can show you.
The blue and red lights didn't just flash, they pulsed, reflecting off the pristine white pickets of the suburban fences like a rhythmic neon heartbeat. Dr. Jonathan Vance was less than 50 yards from his own front door. He could see the warm, yellow glow of the lamp his wife kept in the window, a beacon of safety that felt suddenly, terrifyingly, out of reach. He sat in his silver sedan, his hands gripped so tightly around the leather steering wheel that his knuckles were as white as the moon hanging over the university campus he had just left. The engine hummed low, but all Jonathan could hear was the heavy, crunching rhythm of boots on gravel. Crunch, crunch, crunch. A flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, hitting his side view mirror and exploding into a blinding glare that filled the cabin. There was a sharp double tap on the glass. Clink, clink. The sound of a wedding ring or a knuckle hitting the window with a practiced, predatory authority. Jonathan rolled the window down just an inch, the cool night air rushing in, carrying with it the smell of ozone and the metallic tang of a nearby transformer. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jonathan's voice was steady, the voice of a man used to lecturing in halls filled with hundreds of students, but his heart was a trapped bird fluttering against his ribs. The officer didn't answer immediately. He let the silence hang, thick and heavy, as he swept his light across the interior of the car, lingering on a stack of graded midterms and a leather-bound copy of James Baldwin's essays. Finally, the light settled on Jonathan's face. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" the officer asked. His voice was a low rasp, dripping with a casual, unearned familiarity that felt like a slap. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are dissecting a case that serves as a chilling case study in the intersection of ego, authority, and systemic bias. This is the story of how a tenured professor of sociology, a man who spent his life studying the structures of power, became a victim of those very structures on a quiet Tuesday night. It is a story that began with a simple traffic stop and ended with a city facing a $1.1 million reckoning. But more than the money, it is about the price of dignity. In this video, we're going to look at the body camera footage the city tried to bury, the legal battle that shook a university town, and the specific moment an officer's prejudice became a $1 million liability. Before we go further, if you believe that the law should be a shield for the innocent rather than a sword for the biased, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're telling the stories that demand to be heard. Now, to understand how Dr. Vance ended up in handcuffs on his own curb, we have to understand the man behind the wheel. Dr. Jonathan Vance wasn't just a resident of this neighborhood. He was one of its most respected figures. A tenured professor with a focus on civil rights and social policy, he was a man who understood the nuances of the law better than the man currently shining a light in his eyes. He had lived in this quiet, tree-lined enclave for over a decade. He paid his taxes, he volunteered at the local library, and he was known for his late-night walks and drives after a long session of research at the university library. To his students, he was a mentor. To his neighbors, he was the guy who always had a kind word and a recommendation for a good book. But to Officer Marcus Thorne, Jonathan Vance was something else entirely. In the shadows of a poorly lit street, stripped of his titles and his context, the professor was reduced to a silhouette, a suspicious presence in a neighborhood where Thorne believed people like Jonathan didn't belong. The neighborhood itself was a microcosm of the suburban dream, quiet, affluent, and overwhelmingly white. It was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors and where the police were usually called for noise complaints or a lost golden retriever. But for Jonathan, there had always been a subtle, underlying friction. He knew the invisible rules. He knew that despite his PhD, despite his contributions to the city, he had to be twice as careful, twice as polite, and twice as visible. On this particular night, he had stayed late at the office. The semester was ending, and the weight of final grades was pressing down on him. He had pulled into his street, listening to a jazz station on the radio, looking forward to nothing more than a glass of water and the quiet company of his sleeping wife. He hadn't been speeding. He hadn't rolled through a stop sign. He had simply been driving home. But for Officer Thorne, who had been tailing the silver sedan for 3 blocks, Jonathan's presence was a question that needed an aggressive answer. "I live right there," Jonathan said, pointing toward the house with the yellow lamp. "I'm a professor at the university. I'm just coming home from work." Thorne didn't look toward the house. He didn't look at the university faculty sticker clearly displayed in the rear window. Instead, he rested his hand on his holster, a move designed to intimidate, a physical punctuation mark to the tension. "I didn't ask where you lived," Thorne snapped. "I asked for your license and registration. And step out of the car. I smell something." Think about that for a moment. The "I smell something" line. It is the oldest trick in the book of predatory policing, a subjective, unprovable claim used to bypass the Fourth Amendment. Jonathan knew this. He felt the cold spike of adrenaline. He knew that stepping out of the car in this environment, with this officer, changed the stakes from a civil inquiry to a physical confrontation. "Officer, I don't smoke. I don't drink. There is nothing in this car but books," Jonathan said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming the professor again. "May I ask the reason for the stop?" The response wasn't a verbal one. Thorne reached through the window, gripped the door handle from the inside, and yanked it open. The dome light of the car flared to life, exposing Jonathan's vulnerability. Before the professor could protest, he was being hauled out by his shoulder. The midterms he had worked so hard on spilled onto the floor mat, white sheets of paper fluttering like wounded birds. "Don't resist!" Thorne shouted, though Jonathan was standing perfectly still, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender that has become a hauntingly familiar image in American life. The officer spun him around, slamming him against the cold metal frame of the sedan. The impact forced the air out of Jonathan's lungs in a sharp "ung." He felt the bite of the handcuffs, the cold, ratcheting steel digging into his wrists, tighter than necessary. He felt the rough texture of the officer's gloves against his neck. This was a man who had spent 30 years studying the history of the struggle for dignity, and now he was being stripped of it in his own driveway. "You're making a mistake," Jonathan whispered, his forehead pressed against the roof of his car. "I'm doing my job," Thorne countered. He began to search Jonathan, his hands moving with a rough, intrusive efficiency. He pulled out a wallet, a set of keys, and a fountain pen. He threw the keys onto the roof of the car with a loud clack. By now, the commotion had drawn attention. Lights were flicking on in the neighboring houses. Curtains were being pulled back. Jonathan's wife, Sarah, appeared on the porch, her robe clutched around her, her face a mask of confusion that quickly turned to terror. "Jonathan, what's happening? Officer, what are you doing?" Thorne didn't look up. "Get back inside, Mom. This is police business." "Police business?" Sarah cried out, her voice cracking. "He's a professor. He's coming home from work. We live here." But the professor title seemed to only agitate Thorne further. It was as if Jonathan's success was a personal affront to the officer's worldview. As Jonathan was led toward the back of the patrol car, Thorne leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and peppermint. "You think you're better than me because of some books?" he hissed. "In this street, at this time, you're just another guy in a silver car that doesn't belong." This was the moment the mask slipped. This was the moment that would eventually cost the city $1.1 million. It wasn't about a broken taillight or a smell. It was about an officer who saw a black man's success as a challenge to his own authority. It was about the contempt of cop that occurs when a citizen knows their rights and refuses to be cowed by a badge. Jonathan was placed in the back of the patrol car. The air was stale, the plastic seat was hard, and the cage in front of him felt like a barrier between two different worlds. He sat in the dark, watching his own home, watching his wife stand on the porch with her phone to her ear, likely calling the university's legal department. For the next 45 minutes, Jonathan Vance sat in that patrol car. He watched as 2 more backup units arrived, their lights turning his quiet street into a chaotic disco of authority. He watched as Thorne and the other officers tossed his car, throwing his books onto the pavement, stepping on the graded midterms he had spent weeks carefully evaluating. They were looking for something, anything, to justify the stop. A stray seed, a suspicious pill, a weapon. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. As the realization began to set in among the other officers that they had detained a high-profile faculty member with no probable cause, the atmosphere shifted. The aggressive posturing turned into hushed, frantic huddles. Thorne was no longer the hunter. He was a man realizing he had stepped into a trap of his own making. Finally, the door to the patrol car opened. It wasn't Thorne who opened it, but a sergeant who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on Earth. "Dr. Vance, there's been a misunderstanding," the sergeant said, his voice lacking the bite of his subordinate. He reached in and unlocked the handcuffs. Jonathan didn't move immediately. He sat there, his wrists throbbing, the marks of the steel etched into his skin. He looked at the sergeant, and then he looked past him to where Thorne was standing by the silver sedan, looking sullen and unrepentant. "A misunderstanding?" Jonathan asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Is that what you call slamming a man against his car in front of his wife? Is that what you call stepping on his student's work? Is that what you call a misunderstanding?" The sergeant didn't answer. He just gestured for Jonathan to step out. Jonathan stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked toward his car. He began to pick up his books, one by one, shaking the dirt from the covers. He didn't say another word to the police. He didn't need to. He knew that the real conversation was just beginning. The aftermath of that night was a firestorm. Within 48 hours, the university's administration had issued a scathing statement. The student body, many of whom had been taught by Dr. Vance about the history of the Fourth Amendment, were galvanized. They didn't just protest. They showed up at city council meetings with copies of the very midterms the police had stepped on. But the real turning point was the body camera footage. The city initially resisted releasing it, claiming it was part of an internal investigation. But Jonathan Vance wasn't just a professor. He had friends in the media and a legal team that knew exactly which levers to pull. When the footage finally went public, it was devastating. The audio captured Thorne's hissed comments about books and not belonging. It captured the sheer lack of provocation from Jonathan. It showed a man being treated like a threat simply for existing in his own space. The public outcry was immediate and bipartisan. Even those who usually backed the blue found it hard to justify Thorne's behavior. The legal battle that followed was less about if the city would pay and more about how much. Jonathan Vance didn't want a quiet settlement. He wanted a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. His lawyers filed a federal civil rights lawsuit, alleging a violation of the 4th and 14th Amendments. They argued that the stop was racially motivated and that the use of force was entirely excessive given the circumstances. The city's lawyers tried to argue that Thorne was acting in good faith, but the Bodycam audio was an insurmountable obstacle. You can't argue good faith when your own voice is recorded expressing deep-seated personal bias. The case moved through the system with a speed that reflected the city's desperation to make the problem go away. They knew that if this went to a jury, the verdict could be even more astronomical. In the end, the city settled for $1.1 million. It was a staggering amount for a stop that lasted less than an hour and resulted in no permanent physical injury. But the settlement wasn't just for the 60 minutes of detention. It was for the violation of the social contract. It was for the message Thorne had sent, that no amount of education, no amount of success, and no amount of community standing could protect a black man from an officer with a grudge. Drop a comment if you think $1.1 million was enough. Or is there a price that can truly compensate for the loss of the feeling of safety in your own home? Jonathan Vance used a significant portion of that settlement to establish a scholarship for students pursuing careers in civil rights law and to fund an independent police oversight board in the city. He wasn't interested in the money, he was interested in the precedent. But what happened to Officer Thorne? This is the part of the story that often leaves people frustrated. Despite the settlement, despite the video, Thorne wasn't immediately fired. He was placed on administrative leave, protected by the layers of union contracts and civil service laws that make disciplining officers a labyrinthine process. However, the pressure didn't let up. Dr. Vance didn't just take the check and go back to his lectures. He became a fixture at the police commission meetings. He used his academic expertise to dismantle the department's training manuals in public forums. He showed that the "I smell something" tactic was being used disproportionately in specific zip codes. He turned his personal trauma into a data-driven crusade for reform. Eventually, under the weight of the $1.1 million payout and the constant scrutiny, Thorne resigned. He moved to another state, his career in that city over, his name forever linked to one of the most expensive misunderstandings in the county's history. Think about the ripples of this case. A $1.1 million hit to a city budget means something. It means less money for parks, for schools, for road repairs. The taxpayers of that city paid for Officer Thorne's ego. This is why the conversation about police reform isn't just a social one, it's a fiscal one. When we allow officers to operate with bias, we aren't just hurting our citizens, we are bankrupting our communities. For Jonathan Vance, the victory was bittersweet. He still lived in the house with the yellow lamp. He still drove the silver sedan. But the neighborhood felt different. The invisible rules he had always navigated were now visible to everyone. Every time he saw a patrol car in his rearview mirror, his hands still tightened on the wheel. His knuckles still turned white. The settlement didn't fix his nervous system. It only validated his struggle. This case is often cited in legal textbooks now, not because of the complexity of the law, but because of the clarity of the injustice. It serves as a reminder that the Fourth Amendment isn't a suggestion. It is a requirement. It reminds us that reasonable suspicion must be based on facts, not on a feeling that someone is out of place. The professor on the curb became a symbol. But Jonathan Vance resisted that. He didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted to be a professor. He wanted to go back to his research, back to his students, and back to the quiet life he had built. He often tells his students that the law is like a garden. It only produces what you are willing to tend to. If you let the weeds of bias and ego grow unchecked, they will eventually choke out the flowers of justice. As we look at the broader implications, we have to talk about the qualified immunity doctrine. It's the legal shield that often protects officers from being sued personally. In this case, the city settled, but Thorne himself walked away without a personal financial penalty. This is a point of contention in civil rights circles. Should the taxpayers bear the burden of an officer's personal racism? The $1.1 million was a victory for Dr. Vance, but it also highlighted the structural flaws in how we hold individuals accountable. If Thorne had to pay even a fraction of that out of his own pocket, would he have been so quick to pull Jonathan out of the car? It's a question that's being debated in state houses across the country. Some states are beginning to limit qualified immunity, making the Thornes of the world personally liable for their actions. Looking back, the night of the stop was a catalyst for the entire city. It forced a conversation that had been simmering under the surface for decades. The university and the city, once at odds, began to collaborate on a series of Know Your Rights workshops, led by Dr. Vance himself. He took the very experience that was meant to diminish him and used it to empower others. He would often stand in front of a room of young people, many of them black and brown, and tell them, "Your dignity is not a gift from the state. It is yours by birth. The law is meant to protect it, but when it fails, you must have the courage and the knowledge to demand it back." He became a living example of that principle, but let's not lose sight of the emotional toll. Sarah Vance, Jonathan's wife, spoke in an interview about the afterward. She talked about the way their house no longer felt like a fortress. She talked about the way she would wait up for him, staring at that yellow lamp until she heard the sound of his key in the lock. The $1.1 million couldn't buy back her peace of mind. This is the hidden cost of harassment. It isn't just the moment of the stop, it's the years of anxiety that follow. It's the way a community looks at its police force, not as guardians, but as a force to be managed, feared, or avoided. The $1.1 million was a start, but the real work of rebuilding trust is much, much harder than writing a check. So, as we reach the end of this story, think about the silver sedan. Think about the midterms on the floor. Think about the man who was told he didn't belong in his own driveway. The case of Dr. Jonathan Vance is a reminder that justice is often a long, expensive, and painful road, but it is a road we must keep walking. Drop a comment below. How can we prevent contempt of kopsop incidents from turning into million-dollar tragedies? Is more training the answer, or do we need deeper, systemic changes to how we police our neighborhoods? We want to hear from you, because these conversations are how we move from a settlement to a solution. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please share it. Let's make sure that the names of people like Dr. Vance are remembered not just for what happened to them, but for how they fought back. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the cases that define our world. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and remember, your rights go with you wherever you go, even if it's just 50 yards from your own front door.